young boy, sat with a crying widow in the rain. 500 men stood guard outside her house. That night, it was dusk in Black Hollow, that strange hour when the sky forgets whether it is night or morning, and the air carries a hush that no one dares break. The town lay wrapped in the kind of silence that came after years of loud loss, the kind of silence that made old wind chimes sway even when there was no wind, and made pine needles crackle under the weight of memories. Rain had begun to fall in that lazy, sorrowful way, soft, steady, indifferent, soaking the rusted fences, the muddy road, and the chipped white porch of a forgotten house on Elm Street. On that porch sat a boy named Caleb Rourke, no more than 12, small for his age, with eyes too quiet for childhood. His shoes were wet, his denim jacket too thin for the chill in the rain, but he did not move. His gaze remained fixed on the woman who knelt in the yard, soaked to the bone, her fingers sunk into the earth like she was trying to pull someone back from underneath it. Her name was Grace Whitmore. She wore a black dress without a coat, and her dark hair clung to her face in strands, braided once and broken now. She didn't sob, she didn't scream. She just trembled in a way that made the world feel off balance. Her hands were covered in soil and something older than soil, memory maybe, or guilt. Caleb didn't know her story, not really. He only knew that she was the widow of Sergeant Thomas Whitmore, who never returned from a place no one in town liked to name, and that since his funeral 2 months ago, no one had spoken to her. Not kindly, anyway. People in Black Hollow didn't understand the kind of grief that made a woman dig into her garden like it could give her back her dead. They called her strange. They whispered she was cursed. But Caleb had once seen her give half her bread to a stray dog during the dry summer. He remembered the way she'd fixed a broken fence no one asked her to. And so, when he found her collapsed by the rosebush in the rain, he didn't ask questions. He simply sat down next to her and placed his own little hand over hers. It was the kind of gesture the world wasn't built to see. But something in the wind paused, something in the earth listened, and somewhere, without a word being spoken, the town began to change. The rain did not let up. It fell in rhythm, steady as a heartbeat long ignored. Caleb sat with her until her fingers stopped clawing the earth and simply rested on it, like a tired apology. She had not spoken, nor had he. But when she finally looked up, just slightly, barely lifting her chin, her eyes met his, and in that fragile glance, something passed between them that didn't need explaining. Grace didn't ask who he was, and Caleb didn't ask what she was doing out there. Instead, he stood up slowly, brushed mud off his knees, and disappeared around the side of the house. When he returned, he held a folded wool blanket from his grandfather's truck. He draped it over her shoulders with the awkward care only a child could offer, one part instinct, one part reverence. The gesture made her flinch, not from fear, but from the shock of warmth. She had forgotten what it felt like to be touched without pity. Grace didn't say thank you. She just pulled the blanket close and sat on the steps, her legs trembling beneath her. Caleb sat beside her again, both of them dripping, but now wrapped in a silence that no longer hurt. It was a silence that held space, like an old barn holds dust and light, slow, sacred, and almost forgotten. Caleb didn't go home that night. He waited until the rain eased and the clouds cracked open just enough to reveal a sliver of moon. Grace had eventually gone inside, not saying a word, but leaving the screen door open behind her. Caleb took that as permission. He stepped in slowly, brushing water from his brow. The house smelled of damp cedar, old coffee, and something faintly floral, maybe her husband's cologne left behind on coats that still hung near the door. In the corner, near the unlit fireplace, a photograph sat askew. Caleb saw it and paused. A man in uniform, smiling wide, held a small dog in his arms. Next to him stood Grace, much younger, hair in a neat braid, eyes so full they seemed borrowed from someone else's face. Caleb didn't stare long. It felt too personal, like stepping into someone's prayer. He found a few matches and lit the old oil lamp. Grace had already curled up on the couch, soaked hair resting on a folded towel, blanket wrapped around her like armor. Her eyes were closed, but not asleep, not fully. Caleb didn't ask where the rest of the town was. He didn't ask why no one checked on her, why the pastor stopped coming by, why the mail hadn't been touched in days. He already knew. Black Hollow had a way of forgetting the inconvenient, especially the grieving, especially the women who didn't cry the right way. That night, he made them both a peanut butter sandwich from her quiet kitchen. He didn't ask. She didn't stop him. He left one beside her, on a paper towel, and took the other outside to sit on the porch again. He watched the road like he was keeping guard, though no one passed, and no one cared. But in that stillness, with the door half open and her breath faintly audible inside, Caleb felt something click into place. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was purpose. Maybe it was sadness. Maybe it was both. But it was enough for him to decide. He wouldn't tell anyone he'd been there. Not his grandfather, not his school friends, not the pastor. This moment didn't belong to the world. It belonged to the rain, the silence, the woman who stopped digging, and the boy who stayed. Morning didn't come with sunlight in Black Hollow. It came with mist, thick, unmoving, the kind that made fences vanish and turned memories into fog. Caleb hadn't slept. He'd curled up on the porch beneath a damp coat he found by the woodpile and listened to the house breathe. Inside, Grace hadn't stirred, but by dawn, she was up. She moved slowly, as if her limbs didn't trust her anymore, and when she found him still there, her lips parted slightly in disbelief. Still, she said nothing. She simply brought him a mug of warm water with a single slice of lemon in it, the kind of thing someone once taught her meant care. Caleb took it with both hands and nodded. That was their first exchange. No words, just warmth passed from one wounded soul to another. Later that morning, while the town remained uninterested in the widow's silence, Caleb wandered the back of the property. He found a collapsed shed, a rusted wheelbarrow, and a string of empty canning jars still lined up on a wooden shelf like forgotten soldiers. Something about them felt sacred, like they had held life once, and now only held light. He turned and found Grace watching him from the back door, holding a folded shirt in her hand. It was too small to be her husband's. Caleb stepped forward and took it gently. It fit him better than what he had on. When he looked up again, her eyes were far away, locked on a part of the sky that no longer spoke. That afternoon, she spoke for the first time. His name was Thomas, she said, barely audible, like speaking it out loud was an act of rebellion. He loved building things, not killing. She paused. Caleb didn't interrupt. They said he died saving men who never came home, said they buried him over there. But the box they gave me, it was too light. Her hands trembled as she spoke. Too light for a man who laughed that loud, who held me that close. Caleb didn't know what to say, so he just stood beside her as she sat in the worn chair by the fireplace, her thumb running absently over a frayed ribbon on her wrist. A token, a keepsake, something she hadn't removed even when the rain came down. The next day, the mayor's wife stopped by. Not to help, but to look. She knocked, waited, then opened the screen door without invitation. Her name was Mrs. Rowley. She had once chaired the church council and sold jam at the market like it was salvation. Her eyes scanned the room and froze when they landed on Caleb. "You can't be here," she said coldly. "She's not right in the head. You're a child." Grace didn't rise. She simply looked at her, eyes dull but steady. "He's the only one who stayed," she said. "The only one who didn't bring a casserole and leave before the tea boiled." Mrs. Rowley bristled, stepped back, then murmured something about concerned parents and town reputation, before disappearing like mist touched by sun. Caleb didn't ask who she really was. He knew now, not from what Grace said, but from what she didn't, the way she watched the world warily, the way her body flinched when someone knocked too hard, the way she never turned her back to an open door. It wasn't just grief she carried. It was abandonment layered with betrayal. The church hadn't just forgotten her. It had exiled her, quietly, politely, with pamphlets and prayers. And now, with each hour Caleb remained, he felt the shape of that truth settle in his bones like winter. By the third day, the town began to notice. Not loudly, not with protest or pitchforks. Black Hollow didn't operate on confrontation. It worked in glances, in gossip, passed between mailboxes, in the way people paused just a little longer at the edge of the street. Children were told not to go near that house, and Caleb's name began to drift through front porches like wood smoke, not shouted, just spoken in warning. "The Rourke boy's been staying with her," one voice said. "It's not right," replied another. "Someone should do something." But no one did, not yet. They only watched. Even the animals noticed. A stray dog, ribs visible beneath matted fur, sat every afternoon across the road, never barking, just watching the porch. A crow began landing on the gable each morning, silent, eyes like ink. The sky dimmed even when the sun tried to break through, and the wind changed, not in direction, but in meaning. It now carried with it the hum of judgment, not from heaven, but from earth itself. Black Hollow was holding its breath. Caleb continued staying. He came and went quietly, slipping past fence posts and alleyways, returning each evening with a loaf of bread or a can of peaches from his grandfather's pantry. The old man hadn't asked, but Caleb knew he suspected something. The silence between them had grown heavier. Still, he said nothing. Grace, for her part, moved slower each day, her strength seeming to drain with each cautious smile she offered the boy. The house, once only a monument to grief, now became something else, a place where the unspoken was honored. She began to write again, not letters, not diaries, but phrases on scraps of paper, which she left near the window. He laughed when he danced. They took his name but not his echo. Some things grow after fire. And then, on the fifth night, something changed. They came. Not police, not church women with casseroles. Men. Quiet men. Working men. Soldiers without uniforms. A farmer who had once served with Thomas Whitmore. A mechanic who remembered how Grace helped fix his wife's leg brace one winter. A teacher who never forgot that Grace once defended a boy wrongly accused of theft. One by one, without coordination or invitation, they arrived. Boots in the dirt, coats in the wind. Some brought lanterns. Others brought only their presence. No one knocked. No one spoke. They simply stood, lining the edge of her property like trees born of loyalty. By midnight, there were 500 of them. Not a protest, not a movement. Just men standing guard in the rain. Some held umbrellas. Most didn't. One placed a folded flag on the fence and walked back into the dark. Another lit a single candle and left it burning by the mailbox. None of them asked Caleb who he was or why he stayed. But when they looked at him, they nodded. The kind of nod that says, "We understand what you've chosen, and we are choosing with you." Inside, Grace sat in her chair by the fireplace, unaware at first. When she rose and looked out, her knees nearly buckled. The sight of them, still unmoving, soaked, broke something in her. Not her heart, her fear. She clutched the edge of the curtain and whispered something Caleb couldn't hear, but he knew what it meant. She was no longer alone, and the town, for all its silence, had finally spoken, not through words, but through presence. It was the kind of revolution that makes no sound, yet echoes forever. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from emptiness, but from awe. Outside, the vigil of 500 held its shape beneath the moonlight and drizzle, their figures ghostly and unmoving, as if time itself had come to a halt in reverence. Inside, Grace stood at the hearth, her shoulders hunched not from cold but from weight. Caleb sat across from her on the old rug, legs crossed, hands resting in his lap. The oil lamp flickered between them, casting long shadows that trembled with breath. She didn't look at him when she spoke. Her voice cracked like glass under strain. "I didn't go to the funeral." The words fell into the space like stones, dropped into a well. Caleb didn't speak, didn't flinch, just listened. "They told me he died saving a convoy, that he radioed for backup and stayed behind. A hero's death, they said. But I read the letter he never meant to send." Her eyes were glassed with memory now, unfocused. He wanted to leave the unit. He was tired. Said he couldn't do it anymore. Said war made liars out of men who once loved truth. She swallowed hard, her hands gripping the mantel until her knuckles whitened. "He asked me to forgive him for wanting to run." Caleb rose slowly, not out of discomfort but reverence. He approached her, small steps, bare feet on wood. "You didn't run," he said simply. Grace turned toward him, and for the first time, her face didn't carry the shape of grief. It carried shame. "But I did," she whispered. "When the flag came, when the town gathered, when the priest asked me to speak, I stayed inside. I closed the door. I didn't cry for them. I didn't mourn for him the way they needed me to. I buried my husband with silence." Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a pin, military, old, tarnished. He'd taken it from the coat his grandfather had left hanging in the shed, the one he wore only once a year at the memorial service. Caleb placed it gently on the mantel next to the photograph of Thomas Whitmore. "That wasn't silence," he said. "That was yours to keep, not theirs to take." Something in her cracked, but it didn't break. It opened. Grace knelt, suddenly and without grace, her knees hitting the floor with a soft thud. Her hands trembled as she reached for Caleb's. "You shouldn't have had to carry this," she whispered. "You're just a boy." But Caleb shook his head, tears in his eyes now, the first he'd allowed himself to show. "You stayed," he said. "So did I. That makes us more than what they called us." She wrapped her arms around him, gently, like someone cradling a letter too sacred to unfold. In that embrace, something unseen passed between them. Not healing, not yet, but the possibility of it. A folded pin on the mantel, a boy's hand in a widow's, and outside, 500 men waiting in the rain, as if the world had been put on hold for something holy to happen. By the 7th day, the crowd had thinned, not from abandonment, but from trust. The town had offered its silence, its witness, its reckoning, and now it stepped back. The porch returned to its solitude. The road dried slowly under a kinder sun. Grace had begun to move through the house with more certainty, her steps no longer ghost-like. She'd even cleared the front room, letting in light, as if testing whether the world outside could be bearable again. Caleb, too, felt the shift. He had started walking home at night, returning each morning before breakfast with biscuits and jam. They no longer avoided conversation. It came gently, in the rhythm of shared space, not stories, but acknowledgements. When Grace swept, Caleb dusted. When Caleb fixed the porch railing, Grace painted it. A rhythm without explanation. A companionship that asked for nothing, but gave much. Then, just when it felt like the ache had learned how to sleep, he returned. His name was Richard Lane, and he wore the kind of suit that tried to erase the man inside it. He arrived mid-morning in a grey car that didn't belong on that road. Dust curled around the tires like warning smoke. He parked, stepped out, and surveyed the house with a face that didn't belong to mourning. Richard had once called Thomas Whitmore his best friend. They'd served together, trained together, and according to town rumor, Grace had known Richard before she ever met Thomas. The rumors had always been soft, half-believed, until the funeral, when Richard didn't come. And now, here he was, 2 months late, sunglasses in hand, carrying a briefcase instead of flowers. Caleb was the one who opened the door. He looked up at the man and felt, for the first time, something cold coil around his ribs. Richard didn't smile. "Is Grace home?" he asked. His voice was polite. Too polite. Caleb nodded slowly and stepped aside. Grace stood at the hallway's edge, arms crossed, hair tied back, face calm. "You don't belong here," she said without flinching. Richard blinked, surprised. "You didn't even ask why I came." "I already know," she replied. "You came to collect what was never yours." He stepped forward but didn't press. "Thomas asked me to deliver something before he left. He didn't trust the others." He opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of yellowed letters, bound in twine. "He wrote these to you, every week. But the unit's mail was being intercepted. He gave them to me to bring home." Grace didn't take them. She stared at them like they were a wound. "And you waited 2 months?" Richard's throat tightened. "I was ashamed and angry. He died saving me. I didn't think I had the right." There it was. Truth, raw and unpolished. Not dramatic, just terrible and human. Grace stepped forward, took the letters without speaking, and walked past him to the porch. Caleb followed her, standing beside her as she sat and untied the twine with shaking hands. She didn't read them all, just the first one. It began with "Dearest Grace," and ended with, "Whatever happens, forgive the world before it forgets you." A single tear traced her cheek. Caleb placed a hand on her shoulder. Richard stood by the door, unmoving, awaiting judgment. But none came. Grace didn't ask him to stay. She didn't ask him to leave. She simply handed him the last letter and said, "Read it. Then decide if you want to keep disappearing." That night, Richard sat by the fence alone, in the same spot where others had stood. Not as a soldier, not as a rival, but as a man returned not to reclaim, but to reckon. And for the first time in years, the town saw Grace Whitmore with eyes unclouded by suspicion. Her house, once a shrine to grief, had become a living place again. Not perfect, not whole, but undeniably, irreversibly changed. The seasons shifted as if they too had been watching. The brittle chill of early spring gave way to slow warmth, the kind that softened the ground and coaxed life from forgotten places. Grass grew again along the fence line, and the rosebush that once stood as Grace's altar began to bloom. Pale, unsure petals at first, but blooming nonetheless. Caleb no longer came every day, not because he had left her, but because she no longer needed him in the same way. He visited once a week, sometimes twice, always bringing something small, a jar of jam, a folded drawing, once even a hammer when the roof began to sag. His presence had changed from lifeline to lighthouse, steady, visible, guiding. Grace started baking again. The scent of cinnamon and browned butter drifted through the kitchen window some mornings, and people passing by would pause, inhale, and say nothing. But their silence had changed, no longer cold avoidance, but quiet respect. Children no longer crossed the street to avoid her home. Neighbors waved. The postman lingered at the gate, tipping his hat. No grand apologies were made, but in small ways, the town admitted what it once refused to see, that grief was not madness, and survival did not need permission. Richard Lane never fully returned, but he never truly left either. He came once a month, always without warning, bringing stories he remembered about Thomas, things Grace had never heard, things she didn't know she wanted to know until he told them. He never stayed long, but he left the letters behind, all of them, wrapped in the same twine but now placed in a carved wooden box beside the hearth. Grace kept it open. One day, Caleb placed something beside the box, the pin he'd once given her, now glued carefully to a piece of oak. He'd carved into it with trembling hands, "You stayed. So did I." She didn't say a word when she saw it, but that night she lit a single candle beside it and let it burn till morning. Years passed. Grace aged with a softness not stolen by sorrow. Her hair silvered, her back bent slightly, but her eyes remained clear. When she walked through town, she was no longer whispered about. She was nodded to, held in shared memory. The house remained hers until the day she chose to leave it, not in a coffin, not in retreat, but by handing the key to a young couple starting a family, saying only, "Make sure it remembers warmth." And long after she left, the town remembered that week when 500 men stood in silence, when a boy held a grieving hand, when a woman returned from the edge of forgetting. They remembered not the storm, but the shelter. And in a house once built of sorrow, a single carved pin rested on a mantle, proof that the world can be changed without raising a single fist.